The eviction notice had my signature on it. I want you to understand what I mean when I say that. Not metaphorically. Not as a figure of speech. The document that ended Marcus Holt's access to the 47th floor, and every floor below it and every floor above it, had been signed by Dr. Renata Solis Vance, Chief of Property Holdings and Medical Facilities Director, Vance Calder Group, LLC. That was my name. That was my title. That was my signature, in blue ink, on the bottom right corner of a legal document that Marcus had not yet read when he handed it back to me. He had handed it back. He hadn't looked at it closely enough to see whose name was on it. Marcus Holt, Regional Operations Supervisor for Graymark Building Solutions, had been my direct supervisor for 11 months. In those 11 months, he had mispronounced my name 14 times, interrupted me in 9 meetings, and on 3 separate occasions had assigned my completed work to a male colleague named Derek Foss without acknowledgement or correction. I had kept a log. Not out of bitterness, out of habit. Medical professionals document everything. I had been documenting things long before I ever set foot in Marcus's morning briefings. The morning it happened, I arrived at 6:47 a.m. The Graymark offices occupied floors 12 through 16 of the Calder Center Tower on Meridian Boulevard. I knew the building intimately, not as an employee, but as the person whose name appeared on the amended deed filed with the county assessor's office on March 9, 2 years prior. I had purchased the building through the Vance Calder Group in a transaction my attorney, Dominic Farrell of Farrell and Osei Legal Partners, had structured across 18 months of careful, quiet work. Marcus didn't know that. He thought I was a mid-level operations coordinator who had been hired to help streamline the building's facilities management contracts. That was the role I had taken, deliberately, because I needed to understand what Graymark was doing with the leases before I made my next move. I needed to see it from the inside. So I had walked in with a resume that was technically accurate and strategically incomplete, taken the job, and spent 11 months watching. On the morning of the eviction, Marcus called an all-staff meeting at 7:15. He was in a particular kind of mood, the kind that comes from someone who has just been told by someone above him that a problem exists and has decided the most efficient response is to locate someone below him to absorb it. The problem, as he explained it with both hands pressed flat on the conference table, was that Graymark's lease on floors 12 through 22 had not been renewed under the new building ownership. The new ownership had sent a facilities review notice. Graymark had ignored it. Then a formal request for lease renegotiation. Graymark had referred it to their legal department, who had not responded in the required window, and now, Marcus explained, there was apparently an issue. He looked at me when he said the word issue. Solis, he said, he always dropped the Vance. You were supposed to track the correspondence on the facilities side. What happened? I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, I tracked it. I documented every communication. The legal department elected not to respond. He made a sound I can only describe as a managed sigh with contempt embedded in it. Well, he said, someone's going to have to walk it up to the building management office and figure this out face to face. 65th floor. He tapped the table twice. That's you. There were 9 people in that room. I watched each of their faces arrange themselves into the particular expression that workplace humiliation produces in bystanders, a calibrated neutrality that protects the witness and abandons the target. I had seen it many times before. I had seen it on the faces of colleagues years earlier, in rooms very different from this one. I knew the expression well. I had made my peace with it long ago. I said, the elevator, he shrugged. Maintenance, building issue, walking only. He looked at his phone. Should take you about 45 minutes. Bring something to take notes on. I picked up my leather portfolio from the table. He smiled, I smiled. I started climbing. Hello, everyone, Dr. Renata Solis Vance here. Before I go any further, if anyone has ever told you that you were not capable, not qualified, not worth the investment, and if you've had to watch someone deliver that verdict with a smile, please leave a comment below. I want to hear from you. I read every one. But to understand what happened when I reached the 65th floor that morning, and why I handed Marcus Holt what I handed him, you have to understand where I came from. You have to go back 22 years. Back to a kitchen in Tucson, Arizona, to a Tuesday evening in November, to a conversation that changed the direction of my life so completely that I am still not entirely sure who I would have been without it. Let me take you there. I was 23 years old. My mother, Gloria Solis, was 51. She sat at the kitchen table across from my uncle Rodrigo and my aunt Patricia, and the three of them had arranged their faces into the particular formation that families compose when they have collectively agreed on something and are preparing to deliver it as though it is a kindness. My grandmother had died 8 weeks earlier. Her name was Consuelo Vance Solis. She had hyphenated when she married, a decision my uncle Rodrigo had never fully accepted, and she had left behind a small estate. Not large by most measures. A house in the Rincon Valley neighborhood, a savings account containing $47,000, and a handwritten note to me that said, in her careful English, "For your schooling. For whatever school asks of you, use it well." She had told me this directly, 3 months before she died. I had been sitting with her in her room at the Sonoran Care Facility on East Speedway, watching her hands, which had become so thin I could see the architecture of the bones beneath them, and she had said, "Renata, I want you to be a doctor. I've always wanted you to be a doctor. I am going to make sure you have what you need." I had not told anyone else about that conversation. I should have had a lawyer. I know that now, I didn't know it then. When the estate was processed, my uncle Rodrigo was named executor. He had been named executor 3 years earlier, in a document my grandmother had signed when her cognition was not what it would later become. By the time she told me about my inheritance, she had lost the clarity of mind required to update the formal documents, though she had never lost the clarity of intention. Rodrigo knew what she wanted. He had been in the room for at least 2 of those conversations. The $47,000 went to a joint account that Rodrigo and my mother managed as a family fund, for the benefit of my grandmother's children and grandchildren broadly construed. My grandmother's note, which I had brought to that kitchen table in a Ziploc bag because I had not known how else to protect it, was placed in the center of the table and regarded by the three of them with an expression I can only describe as anthropological. My uncle Rodrigo picked it up and read it. He set it down. He looked at my mother. Then he looked at me. "Your grandmother loved you very much," he said, "but she didn't understand what a formal estate looks like. This isn't a legal document, Renata. This is a piece of paper." "It's her intention," I said. "Intentions," he said, "don't pay probate fees." My Aunt Patricia, who had not spoken yet and would not speak for another 4 minutes, reached across the table and patted my hand. "There'll be something for you," she said. "When things settle." Things never settled. I waited. I asked twice in the first year. My mother told me I was being ungrateful. My uncle Rodrigo told me, at a Christmas gathering where his children were opening gifts that had been purchased with money from that account, that I needed to stop making this about one person and think about what your grandmother actually would have wanted, which was for this family to stay together. I was 24 by then. I had been enrolled part-time at Pima Community College for 2 years, taking pre-science requirements when I could afford tuition, which was not reliably. I was working 27 hours a week at a radiology front desk on Craycroft Road. I was not making enough money to save. Every semester I fell behind. Every time I fell behind, I told myself I would make it up the following term. My mother sat me down in January of that year and said, "You should think about something more practical, something with a clear job at the end. Medical school is for people who have support." "I have support," I said. She looked at me with an expression I recognized. "You have determination," she said. "That's different." My uncle Rodrigo's version was less gentle. He said it once at a family dinner in front of 7 other people while I was clearing plates. "She's not the academic type. She never was. Some people aren't, and it's nothing to be ashamed of." No one said anything. I set the plates in the sink. I turned on the faucet. I stood there with my hands under the water long enough for my eyes to stop doing what they were trying to do. Then I dried my hands, went to the bathroom, took out the piece of paper I kept folded in my wallet, and read it. It said, Master of Science in Molecular Biology, Pre-Medical Track, University of Arizona, College of Science. Application deadline, February 1st. I had written it down in the public library 6 months earlier from a university pamphlet. I had folded it into quarters and put it in the bill compartment of my wallet behind my library card. I had read it 40 or 50 times by then. I read it again. I put it back. I went back to the dinner. I decided that night that I was done arguing with them, not because I agreed, not because they had beaten me, but because I finally understood something that took me almost 2 years of waiting to understand. The money was gone, the argument was pointless, and every minute I spent trying to recover what they had taken was a minute I was not spending building what they claimed I was incapable of building. That was the trade they were asking me to make, whether they knew it or not. I declined. The University of Arizona's application fee was $85. I paid it in cash. I mailed the application on January 28th, 4 days before the deadline, at the post office on 6th Avenue. I remember the exact feeling of pressing the envelope into the metal slot. It felt irreversible in the best possible way. I was rejected. Not from the MS program. I was accepted there, conditionally, pending completion of one remaining coursework prerequisite. I was rejected from the financial aid package I needed to attend. The conditional acceptance came in a beige envelope. The financial aid denial came 3 weeks later in a white one. I sat with both of them on my kitchen table for a long time. The prerequisite I was missing was an upper division biochemistry course that was only offered at the main campus, which required full enrollment status, which required tuition I did not have. I did the math 4 times over 2 days. I was $3,200 short, not $32,000, not $320,000, $3,200. That was the number that stood between me and conditional acceptance into a graduate program at a state university. I called the financial aid office and spoke to a woman named Carla Hutchins, who was kind, professionally constrained, and ultimately unable to help me through official channels. But at the end of our conversation, she said, "Have you looked at the departmental awards? The Molecular Sciences Department has 2 discretionary awards that don't go through central aid. They're small, but they're not nothing." I had not looked at the departmental awards. I applied for both that afternoon. The larger one was $2,500. The smaller one was $800. I wrote both essays in one sitting on a borrowed laptop at the public library on Stone Avenue. I submitted them at 11:47 p.m. I received the $800 award. I did not receive the $2,500 one. I was still $2,400 short. Dr. Imara Osai-Mensah, associate professor of biochemistry at the University of Arizona, had served on the award committee that gave me the $800. She emailed me 2 days after the award was announced. She said she had read my application and wanted to talk. I went to her office hours the following Thursday. She had a small office on the 3rd floor of the Biosciences building, stacked on 3 sides with journals and bound dissertations, with a single plant in the window that looked like it had survived conditions harsher than direct sunlight. She asked me about my background. I told her. All of it, more than I had told anyone, including the kitchen in Tucson and the piece of paper in my wallet. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "I can offer you 12 hours a week as a lab assistant. It's $14.5 an hour. It won't cover everything, but if you defer 1 semester and bank the hours, it will cover the gap." I deferred 1 semester. I worked in Dr. Osai-Mensah's lab for 22 weeks. I learned in that time more about tissue assay preparation and centrifuge calibration than I had learned in 2 years of front desk radiology work. I also learned from watching her what it looked like to hold an entire department's attention in a room without raising your voice. I paid attention to that too. When I enrolled the following fall, I was not behind, I was ready. My mother called twice that semester. Neither call mentioned the university. The first was about a plumbing problem at the house. The second was a birthday greeting, brief, warm in the way that warmth can be performed. I did not tell her where I was. I did not tell any of them. I had given up the argument, but I had not given up the plan. Those were different things, and it took me a long time to learn to hold them separately. By the time I sat for my MCAT for the second time, I had taken it once before, 2 years prior, with insufficient preparation and a 32-hour work week. I was 27 years old and working as a clinical research coordinator at the Sonoran Institute for Biomedical Studies on Campbell Avenue. The position had come through a posting on the University of Arizona's internal board, and I had been hired by Dr. Ernesto Pacheco Ruiz, the institute's director, who had interviewed me for 40 minutes and then said, "You have a gift for pattern recognition. That's not teachable. Everything else is." That was the first time anyone with professional authority had said something like that to me. I wrote it in my journal that night not because I needed validation, but because I wanted a record of the exact words, so that I could return to them in the moments when other words tried to take up the same space. The MCAT score came back on a Friday morning in October. I checked it on a public computer at the institute during my lunch break. A 514, 91st percentile. I sat very still for approximately 90 seconds. Then I closed the browser, finished my sandwich, and went back to work. The medical school application cycle was the hardest logistical period of my life to that point. I applied to 11 schools. The application fees alone came to $1,340, which I had saved across 7 months by taking a second weekend position doing medical records data entry for a billing company in Marana. I want you to understand what I mean when I say medical records data entry for a billing company in Marana on weekends. I drove 40 minutes each way. I entered diagnostic codes for 8 hours. I drove back. Every weekend. For 7 months. So that I could pay 11 application fees. I was accepted by 3 schools. I enrolled at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine in Albuquerque. The funding package included a scholarship covering 60% of tuition, 2 research fellowships in my areas of interest, and a stipend that covered rent in a 1-bedroom apartment 12 minutes from the main hospital. I moved to Albuquerque on a Sunday in August. I loaded everything I owned into a 5x8 cargo trailer. I drove it myself. At no point did I call anyone in my family to tell them. There was a period, shortly after I arrived, when I thought about calling my mother, not to announce anything, just to hear her voice maybe, to say that I was somewhere new and that things felt large and real and serious. I sat with my phone in my hand for about 3 minutes one evening, in the parking lot of the grocery store on Lomas Boulevard, with the engine running and the windows down, and the smell of September coming through the desert air. Then I put my phone in the glove compartment and went inside to buy groceries. She had told me I wasn't the academic type. She would know differently, but not yet. I had every intention of keeping it that way. I completed my medical degree in 4 years. My residency in internal medicine at the University of New Mexico Hospital ran the standard 3 years, and I entered a fellowship in cardiovascular medicine immediately after 4 years, subspecialty tract, with a research component that would end up defining the next decade of my professional work. I want to be precise about the timeline because precision matters to me, and because what I built was not built quickly, and I will not pretend otherwise. By the time I was 38, I was a board-certified cardiologist with a subspecialty in interventional cardiology, 2 peer-reviewed publications in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, and a junior attending position at St. Helena Medical Center in Phoenix, Arizona, which was, not incidentally, 63 miles from Tucson. I had come back, not to announce myself, not to confront anyone. I had come back because the attending position at St. Helena was the right position, at the right institution, in the right department. The proximity to my family was a fact I processed, filed, and set aside. My supervising attending at St. Helena was Dr. Catherine Mbeki-Ross, Cardiology Department Chief, a woman of measured intensity and extraordinary diagnostic precision who became, over the following years, the closest thing I had to a professional anchor. She had grown up in Nairobi, trained in London, and arrived in Phoenix by a route as circuitous as mine. On my first day of attending rounds, she pulled me aside after I correctly identified a right bundle branch block on an EKG that 2 residents had misread, and said, with no additional commentary, "Good. Come early tomorrow." I came early every day for the next 4 years. The St. Helena Cardiology Department at that time was managing just over 2,400 inpatient admissions per year. I was responsible for a panel of approximately 180 outpatient cases, in addition to my inpatient rotation duties. I covered specialist appointment slots 4 days a week and took research time on Fridays. The physical intensity of the schedule was something I had expected. What I had not fully expected was the emotional weight of managing a cardiology panel in a city where you grew up, where the last names on some of the intake forms were familiar, where the neighborhoods listed under home address were places I had driven through as a teenager. I had been at St. Helena for 14 months when a referral came through the outpatient scheduling system for a specialist appointment in the cardiovascular consult clinic. The referring physician was listed as Dr. Samuel Tran, general practitioner, Rincon Valley Family Medicine. The patient's home address was in the Rincon Valley neighborhood. I looked at the chart for a moment. Then I pulled up the insurance policy information attached to the patient's intake file. The name on the policy was Rodrigo Solis. I set the chart down on the counter. I looked out the window for a moment. Through the glass, I could see the hospital's courtyard, where a jacaranda tree was doing what jacaranda trees do in April in Arizona, dropping purple blossoms in slow, unhurried spirals onto the brick path below. I picked the chart back up. I flagged it for reassignment to one of my colleagues, noted a scheduling conflict, and moved it to the next available slot in Dr. Marcus Webb's consult rotation. I was not ready. The collision was forming. But the timing was not mine to control, and I had learned, over 22 years of building in silence, that the difference between a moment landing correctly and landing prematurely was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was as quiet as setting a chart back down on a counter. I had come that close to everything surfacing before it was time, but it wasn't time yet. The referral sat in Dr. Webb's queue for 11 days. On the 12th day, Dr. Webb had a family emergency and was out for 2 weeks. The clinic coordinator, a methodical and well-meaning woman named Jess Carrillo, rerouted the appointment. She flagged me personally. She said, "I know you noted a conflict, but Dr. Webb is out indefinitely, and this patient is presenting with exertional chest pain and a family history of early-onset coronary disease. We need someone senior." She was right. The clinical picture was urgent. I was the senior cardiologist on rotation that week. I looked at the rerouted chart for a long time, then I told Jess Carrillo I would take it. And I went back to my office to make a phone call I had been preparing for, in one way or another, for the better part of 2 decades. The first call was not to my uncle Rodrigo. It was to Dominic Farrell, of Farrell and Osai Legal Partners, whose number I had kept in my phone under a contact name that said only DF, because there had been a period, years before, when I had not wanted to see that name in my recent calls and be tempted to move before I was ready. "Dominic," I said, "I need to review the financial disclosure documents we prepared last spring, and I need to know the exact status of the Calder Center holdings." There was a brief pause on the line, then Dominic said, "I'll have everything on your desk by morning." He knew what it meant that I was asking. The documents arrived at 7:14 the following morning. Dominic Farrell had sent them by secure courier. A physical envelope, not a digital transfer. Because Dominic was meticulous in the specific way that attorneys become meticulous when they have been handling complex holdings for long enough to understand what a single misfiled email can cost. The envelope contained a 12-page summary of the Vance Calder Group's current asset position, a 1-page status update on the Calder Center Tower lease dispute, and a handwritten note on Farrell and Osai letterhead that said, in Dominic's compressed, angular handwriting, "Ready when you are. The financial disclosure package is complete. Call me." I read everything twice at my kitchen table before I left for the hospital. Then I placed the documents back in the envelope, put the envelope in the interior pocket of my laptop bag, and drove to St. Helena. The appointment with my uncle Rodrigo was scheduled for that Thursday at 2:15 p.m. I want to be precise about what I was feeling in the days between Dominic's envelope and that appointment. People often ask, when they hear this story, or some version of it, whether I was nervous, whether I felt the weight of what was coming. The honest answer is that I felt something closer to clarity than to anxiety. I had been carrying 2 separate identities for a long time: the niece who had been dismissed at a kitchen table in Tucson, and the cardiologist who had spent 15 years building a professional life that the people around that kitchen table knew nothing about. Those 2 identities had coexisted in my life the way tectonic plates coexist. Silently, under pressure, separated by a boundary that everyone who knew me understood was there, but no one had yet named. What Dominic's envelope told me was that the plates were moving. Rodrigo Solis arrived at the St. Helena Outpatient Cardiology Clinic on a Thursday afternoon with a woman I recognized as my cousin Marisol, his daughter, 4 years younger than me, who had attended the same high school I had and had, on one memorable occasion during my junior year, told a table of mutual acquaintances that I was always going to be one of those people who tries too hard. She was 41 now. She sat in the waiting area with her coat folded on her lap and her phone in her hand, and did not look up when I walked through the department. Rodrigo was in exam room 3. He was 69 years old. He had the same broad forehead and deliberate posture I remembered from every family gathering of my childhood. He was wearing a pressed button-down shirt, which told me he had dressed for the appointment, which told me he understood that something about his heart was serious enough to dress for. His chart showed a 6-week history of exertional chest pain, a mildly elevated troponin from an outside lab draw, and an EKG from Dr. Tran's office with ST segment changes in leads III, and AVF that warranted immediate attention. The medical picture was clear. Whatever else was true about this situation, the medical picture was clear, and that part had nothing to do with the kitchen in Tucson or the $47,000 or the piece of paper I had carried in my wallet for 6 years. I knocked twice and opened the door. He looked up. I said, "Good afternoon, I'm Dr. Solis Vance, I'll be your cardiologist today." The recognition came in stages. First the name, then the face. Then the name again, because the two of them, the name he knew and the title preceding it, did not immediately arrange themselves into a coherent picture. I watched him do the arithmetic. His expression moved through something I can only describe as a sequence: recognition, confusion, recalibration. Then he said, "Renata." I said, "Yes." I pulled the rolling stool to the exam table and sat down with his chart open on my knee. "I'd like to review your symptoms. Can you describe the chest pain for me? When does it typically occur?" He stared at me for a moment longer. Then he said, "Yura, you work here." "I'm the senior interventional cardiologist in this department," I said. "I've reviewed your outside records. I'd like to do a full assessment this afternoon." "Can we start with the pain onset?" He answered my questions. I listened. I asked follow-ups. I documented. The entire clinical interaction was exactly what it would have been for any other patient, because that was what the moment required, and because I had learned, over 15 years of medicine, that the clinical encounter is not the appropriate venue for anything other than the clinical encounter. Marisol was standing in the hallway when I came out. She had apparently followed a nurse back from the waiting area and was standing approximately 4 feet from the exam room door. She looked at me with an expression that mixed the same sequence I had seen on Rodrigo's face with something additional, something that I recognized, with a kind of archaeological precision, as the expression of someone who has just understood that a set of assumptions they have been operating under for years is structurally unsound. She said, "You're a doctor here." I said, "I'll have a care plan ready within the hour. Please make sure your father stays for the imaging." I walked back to the nursing station. I kept my face entirely neutral. Inside, in whatever place I keep things that are not available to the surface, something had shifted. I called Dominic Farrell that evening. I signed the first document. There was no going back. The following 8 days were the most deliberately constructed period of my professional life. I want to describe them accurately, because the way the narrative gets told afterward often compresses what was actually a careful, methodical, multi-layered process into something that sounds more spontaneous than it was. Nothing that happened in the days that followed was spontaneous. Every move was planned, and most of the plans had been drafted months or years earlier, waiting for exactly this configuration of circumstances. On Friday morning, I met with Dominic at the Farrell and Osai offices on Camelback Road. The office occupied half of the 4th floor of a building that I had driven past 100 times without noticing, which had always struck me as appropriate. The work that happens inside spaces like that is meant to be unremarkable from the outside. Dominic was at his desk when I arrived. His paralegal, a sharp and quietly formidable woman named Adiz Akaffer, was already seated at the conference table with a printed index of the document set. "Walk me through the estate file first," I said. Dominic opened a folder. "The original probate records from your grandmother's estate are here. This is what was filed with Pima County in 2003. The inventory lists the savings account, the real property, and the personal effects. The account balance at time of filing is documented, $47,000. Here." He turned a page and set it in front of me. "The distribution record shows the account was liquidated and transferred to the joint family account within 60 days of probate close. Your grandmother's handwritten note is on file as Exhibit C. We had it authenticated 2 years ago. A forensic document examiner confirmed it was written in her hand approximately 3 to 4 months before her death." I looked at the authentication report. I had commissioned it quietly, through a separate engagement, before the Calder Center purchase had even closed. I had wanted to know the note was real, not because I doubted it, but because I had learned by then that what you know and what you can demonstrate in a documented proceeding are 2 entirely different categories of fact. "The trust documents," I said. Adiz slid a tab set across the table. "The Vance Calder Family Trust was established in 2019. You are the sole managing trustee. The real property holdings, including the Calder Center Tower and 2 additional investment properties in the East Valley, are held within the trust. All documentation is clean, there are no competing claims. Dominic looked at me. You're not planning to pursue a civil claim against Rodrigo for the estate funds? No, I said. The statute of limitations on that ran out years ago. That's not what this is about. What is it about? I looked at the probate record for a moment. Then I said, it's about making sure that the next time someone in my family is in a room with me, they understand what room they're actually in. Dominic nodded slowly. He said, the lease termination is fully documented. Greymark's legal team had 90 days to respond to the renegotiation notice. They didn't. The eviction proceedings are clean. Adiz said, the financial disclosure package for the Vance Calder Group is complete. If anyone runs a property search on the Calder Center Tower, your name comes up as managing trustee within the first 30 seconds. That had been true for 2 years. No one in my family had run a property search. I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, has anyone contacted you regarding the Solis family name in connection with the Calder Center? No, Dominic said. They will, I said, within the next 2 weeks. He closed the folder. We'll be ready. I left the office at 11:23 a.m. and drove directly to St. Helena, where I had a full afternoon schedule including 3 specialist appointment slots in the Interventional Cardiology Consult Clinic. The second patient that afternoon was a 64-year-old retired schoolteacher named Florence Barrera, who had been managing a complex health insurance coverage dispute with her insurer over a denied cardiac catheterization claim. I had been working with her case for 6 weeks. Her insurance policy had a provision that the insurer was interpreting in a way that was, in my clinical opinion, and in the opinion of the appeals reviewer I had consulted, incorrect. I had written a letter of medical necessity for Florence's procedure 3 times. The third letter had been 4 pages and had cited 7 peer-reviewed articles and 2 applicable state insurance regulations. The authorization came through that afternoon, 2 hours before her appointment. I told her in person. She sat in the exam chair and pressed both hands to her mouth and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she looked at me and said, how do you have the energy for all of this? I said, you needed it done. She shook her head. That's not an answer. I thought about it. Then I said, I grew up being told that effort without connections doesn't go anywhere. I've spent most of my adult life proving that wrong. I suppose I'm still proving it. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, well, keep proving it. I thought about Florence on the drive home. About the specific quality of her relief in that exam room, not just the relief of the medical authorization, but the relief of being taken seriously by an institution that had repeatedly treated her as a category rather than a person. I understood that relief in a way that was not academic. That was the moment I understood exactly how much they had underestimated me. The next evening, my mother called. She called on a Tuesday, which was unusual. She typically called on Sundays, brief calls, warm in the way I had described before, that stayed carefully on the surface of things. A Tuesday call meant something had happened. Rodrigo told me he saw you, she said. At a hospital. Yes, I said. He said you were a doctor there. I'm a cardiologist, I said. Senior attending, interventional subspecialty. There was a pause. Since when? I've been at St. Helena for 4 years, I said. Before that I was at University of New Mexico for my training. It took about 15 years from start to finish. Another pause. You never told us. No, I said. I didn't. Why not? I looked out the window. I had a specific memory of my mother's face at that kitchen table, the careful neutrality of someone who has agreed to something they intend to present as kindness. I held the memory for a moment without showing it anywhere. I needed to build it first, I said. Before anything else. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, Rodrigo has an appointment next week. He said they're talking about a procedure. His care team will keep him informed, I said. I'm not his treating physician, I referred him to a colleague. Oh, she said, I thought he said you were there. I was there for the initial assessment, I said. Continuity of care is handled by Dr. Marcus Webb. I see, she said. She asked about my apartment. I told her it was fine. She asked about the weather in Phoenix. I told her it was warm. She said she might come visit sometime. I said that would be nice. When the call ended, I sat with the phone in my lap for a moment. Dominic had told me that morning that the Greymark legal team had finally made contact, not about the Calder Center, but about an adjacent lease matter, and that the inquiry had been routed through a property search that had pulled the Vance Calder Group name. It was only a matter of time before someone inside Greymark's organization connected the Vance Calder group to Dr. Renata Solis Vance. When that happened, the information would move quickly. She thought she had won the conversation. She had 2 more days before the name became unmissable. The document Dominic filed on Thursday morning was the formal notice of lease termination for Greymark Building Solutions, citing the expired renegotiation window and the outstanding facilities compliance violations. It was filed with the Maricopa County Property Records Office at 9:07 a.m. By 10:30, it had been served to Greymark's registered agent. By noon, it had reached Marcus Holt's desk. By 7:15 the following Monday morning, Marcus had called a staff meeting. And I had climbed 65 floors. The building management office on the 65th floor of the Calder Center Tower was a glass and steel suite with a view of the Phoenix skyline that made the city look, on a clear morning, like something that had been deliberately arranged for effect. I had been in that office many times. I knew the receptionist by name, a steady, professionally unflappable woman named Grace Tomlin who had worked in the building for 9 years, and who, on the morning I arrived slightly out of breath from 65 flights of stairs, looked up from her desk and said, "Dr. Solis Vance, good morning. I'll let Mr. Farrell know you're here." Dominic was waiting in the conference room. Adiz was at the table. 2 members of the Vance Calder management team, James Osai, Operations Director, and Priya Maidalund, Director of Asset Management, were also present. They had been briefed. They knew what the morning was. I had been in the building for 47 minutes by the time Marcus Holt arrived. He had been called in by Greymark's own regional director, a man named Philip Stearns, who had received the lease termination notice and decided that the appropriate response was to come to the building in person with Marcus and 2 members of Greymark's legal team to dispute the filing face-to-face. The Greymark legal team consisted of an associate named Brian Chu and a partner named Kathleen Ford, both of Whitmore and Crane, who were competent, well-dressed, and visibly unaware, when they walked into the 65th floor conference room at 8:43 a.m., that they were about to have a morning that would require significant recalibration. Philip Stearns entered first, then Marcus, then Kathleen Ford, then Brian Chu. Marcus saw me. He stopped walking. He had not processed the stares yet, not fully, not in the way that would have been required to understand what was happening. He had processed them as an inconvenience, a workplace comedy of errors, a subordinate who had been dispatched on an errand and had, improbably, ended up in the same room as the meeting he himself had been summoned to. He looked at me the way people look at something that doesn't fit the pattern they are currently using to organize the world. He said, "Solis. What are you doing up here?" I said, "Good morning, Marcus. Please sit down." Philip Stearns said, "Who is this?" Dominic Farrell, from his position at the head of the conference table, said, "This is Dr. Renata Solis Vance. She is the managing trustee of the Vance Calder Group, LLC, and the owner of record for the Calder Center Tower. You are guests in her building." The room was quiet for approximately 3 seconds. Philip Stearns was 62, silver-haired, and had the particular posture of a man who had spent 40 years being the most powerful person in most rooms he entered. I watched his posture change. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of change that happens when a person's foundational assumption about a situation is removed and the remaining structure has to find a new point of support. His chin came down slightly. His shoulders adjusted. His hand, which had been gesturing toward a chair, went still. Marcus said, "I'm sorry, what?" Kathleen Ford said, "Mr. Farrell, can we clarify the chain of title here? We were told the building was held by an institutional trust." "It is," Dominic said. "The Vance Calder Family Trust. Dr. Solis Vance is the sole managing trustee. All documents are filed with Maricopa County." Adiz placed a tabbed document package in front of each seat at the table. She moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this before, which she had, because Dominic's office was not in the habit of arriving to these meetings unprepared. Kathleen Ford opened her copy. She turned to the deed. She read for a moment. Brian Chu read over her shoulder. His face did something careful. That was the first document. I had 3 more. Marcus picked up his copy and looked at the cover page. He looked at the name at the top, Vance Calder Group, LLC. Managing Trustee, Dr. Renata Solis Vance. He looked at me. He looked back at the page. He said, "You own this building." I said, "I own this building." He said, "The whole building." I said, "Floors 1 through 67, the 2 basement parking levels and the mechanical penthouse. The property deed is on page 3. Philip Stearns said, "How long?" "The purchase closed in March of 2 years ago," I said. "The trust had been accumulating the holding equity for approximately 6 years before that." I looked at the table. "Greymark has been a tenant in a building I own for 2 years, Marcus. You have been my tenant for 2 years." The silence had a specific quality. It was not the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of 8 people, each processing the same information at slightly different rates, each arriving at the same structural conclusion by different internal routes. James Osei, without particular drama, placed a second document in front of Philip Stearns. "This is the formal notice of lease termination," he said. "Filed Thursday morning. The grounds are documented on pages 4 through 9, the outstanding facilities compliance response, and the expired renegotiation window." Kathleen Ford was reading. She had found something. Her expression shifted not to panic, but to the particular controlled recalibration of a lawyer who has identified a problem she is going to need time to solve. She said, "The renegotiation window closure, the notification was sent to Greymark's registered agent." 3 times, Adiz said. "Over a period of 90 days. The first notice, the formal request, and the final compliance deadline, all 3 certified, receipt confirmations are in the appendix." Brian Chu turned to the appendix. He found the receipt confirmations. His jaw did something quiet. Philip Stearns said, "Marcus, you were managing the facilities correspondence for this building." Marcus said, "The legal team was supposed to handle the response." "The legal team," Kathleen Ford said with a measured and entirely professional coolness, "received none of the 3 notices. They were addressed to the registered agent, which is correct, but the registered agent for this region was updated in January and the notification routing was not updated to reflect." She stopped. She looked at Marcus. She said, "Who updated the registered agent information?" Marcus did not answer. I watched him. I had no particular feeling about watching him. What I felt was closer to the feeling of completing a differential diagnosis, the quiet, resolved satisfaction of every variable accounting for itself. I had spent 11 months in meetings with this man. 11 months of mispronounced names and reassigned credit, and the particular small violences that accumulate in workplaces when hierarchy is used as a substitute for judgment. I had documented all of it, not because I had planned to use it. Because I was a physician, and I documented everything. Priya Maidalund placed a third document in front of Philip Stearns. "This is the record of facilities compliance requests from the Building Management Office to Greymark over the past 18 months, she said, "including the 11 that were routed through the Internal Operations Coordinator." She paused. "That was Dr. Solis Vance's position within your organization." Philip Stearns looked at the document. He looked at me. He said, "You were an employee of Greymark." "I was a mid-level operations coordinator," I said. "Hired on contract, 8 months before the lease renegotiation window opened. I needed to understand how Greymark was managing the building's operational compliance from the inside before I made a decision about the lease." Stearns said, "That is completely legal," Dominic said. Dr. Solis Vance disclosed her consulting role accurately. She withheld no information she was obligated to disclose. Did not access any proprietary Greymark records or systems beyond her assigned role. Her contract is on file. Kathleen Ford said, "We're going to need time to review this." "Of course," Dominic said. "The termination notice provides a 60-day vacate window, which is 14 days beyond the statutory minimum for a commercial lease of this classification. The 60-day window begins as of Thursday's filing date." Marcus had not spoken for several minutes. He was looking at the table. Not at any particular document, just at the surface of the table, the way a person looks at a neutral surface when the contents of a room have become temporarily unnavigable. I took the 4th document from my portfolio. I set it in front of him personally. I walked around the table and placed it directly in front of his chair. It was the eviction notice. My signature was on the bottom right corner. His name was in the top left field in the tenant line where it had been for 2 years without his knowledge. He looked at it. He looked at my signature. He looked at me. I did not say anything. I didn't need to say anything. I had climbed 65 flights of stairs to get to this room, and the document said everything that needed to be said, and I had decided, long before I arrived, that this was not a moment for speeches. I handed him the notice. He took it. A woman named Carolyn Velez, St. Helena's chief of medical administration, who had been invited to the meeting as an observer and institutional representative. Because one of the agenda items was the formal transfer of the Vance Calder Group's healthcare facility holdings to a new management structure, and Carolyn was the point of contact for that transition, leaned forward from her seat near the window, and said, quietly, to Philip Stearns, "I think you should probably begin the relocation process." Philip Stearns, for the first time in what I estimated was 40 years of professional life, said nothing. Outside, through the glass, Phoenix arranged itself in the morning light. The jacaranda trees that lined Meridian Boulevard were doing what they always did in late April, releasing their blossoms in the unhurried, unconcerned way of things that have been growing for a long time and have no particular interest in being noticed. I looked at them for a moment. Then I gathered my portfolio. Then I took the elevator down. Graymark Building Solutions vacated the Calder Center Tower in full within 51 days of the termination notice. Kathleen Ford's team reviewed the documentation and concluded, correctly, that the filing was clean and the grounds were solid. There was no legal challenge. The new tenant, a healthcare services consortium that included a satellite cardiology clinic affiliated with St. Helena, signed a 15-year lease at market rate and occupied floors 12 through 22 in the fall. Marcus Holt was placed on administrative review by Graymark's regional office following the discovery of the notification routing failure. He resigned 4 months later. I have no particular feeling about that. The decision was made by his organization, based on his organization's internal findings, and had nothing to do with me beyond being a consequence of the same operational negligence that had characterized those 11 months of morning meetings. Philip Stearns sent a letter to Dominic's office approximately 3 weeks after the meeting. It was brief and formal, and said, in essence, that Graymark respected the findings of the review and wished to maintain a professional relationship with the Vance Calder Group for potential future opportunities. Dominic forwarded it to me with a single-line note. "Your call." I filed it. I didn't respond. My uncle Rodrigo underwent a cardiac catheterization in May. Dr. Marcus Webb performed a successful percutaneous coronary intervention on a significant LAD stenosis. I was not in the room. I reviewed the post-procedure notes as part of my department oversight role and confirmed the clinical management was appropriate. His recovery was uncomplicated. He called me in June. It was the first time he had called me directly in approximately 8 years. He said, "I heard about what happened with your building." "Yes," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't know you had done all that." "I know," I said. "Your grandmother," he started. Then he stopped. Then he started again. "She would have been very proud." I sat with that for a moment. There are things that arrive too late to be fully useful, and that fact does not entirely strip them of their value. The acknowledgement was real. It was also 22 years late. I chose to receive it without giving it more weight than it deserved, and without dismissing it more than was warranted. That felt like the right calibration. I said, "Thank you, Rodrigo." He said he hoped we might have dinner sometime. I said that might be possible. We hung up. I made a note in my calendar to think about it in 3 months. My mother called the following weekend. Her call was longer than usual. She asked about my work. I told her about the cardiology program. She asked about the building. I told her a little. She asked about the money, not in so many words, but the question was there, under the surface of the conversation, and I understood it. I did not discuss my financial position with her. I said, "Things are stable, I'm well." She seemed to accept that. There is a version of this story where I confronted her directly about the kitchen table in Tucson and the $47,000, and the note that Rodrigo had picked up and set back down. I thought about that version for years. I thought about the specific things I would say. I rehearsed them occasionally, the way you rehearse arguments you will never have, not because you intend to have them, but because the rehearsal itself is a form of processing. I never had that conversation. Not because I was afraid of it, because I eventually understood that the conversation I needed to have was with the version of myself who still believed that the outcome of that confrontation would change something. It wouldn't. The kitchen table was 22 years in the past. The $47,000 was spent. My grandmother was gone. The note was authenticated and filed in a legal envelope in Dominic's office. What I had built was not built to win an argument. It was built because I had a piece of paper in my wallet for 6 years, and I had decided, in a bathroom in Tucson, that the most powerful response to being told you are incapable is to become undeniably capable, and then let the world observe it. I had let the world observe it. My current position is Senior Attending Cardiologist and Associate Department Director at St. Helena Medical Center, where I oversee a team of 11 physicians and the department's interventional research program. Dr. Catherine Mbeki-Ross retired last year. She attended my promotion ceremony and afterward, in the hallway outside the conference room, hugged me once, briefly, and said, "I knew in the first week." I told her I appreciated the patience she had shown in waiting for me to prove her right. She said patience had had nothing to do with it. I run 3 specialist appointment sessions per week and maintain a research commitment that includes ongoing collaboration with Dr. Amara Osai-Mensah, who is now a full professor at the University of Arizona, and who, last fall, invited me to deliver the department's annual distinguished lecture. I drove back to Tucson for that lecture. I drove past the radiology office on Craycroft Road, where I had worked the front desk for 2 years. The building had been repainted. The signage was different. I sat in the parking lot for about 4 minutes and then went inside to give the lecture. On Sundays, I run. I have run 5 half marathons in the past 3 years, which I mention not because it is particularly significant, but because physical effort of a specific, measurable kind remains, for me, the most reliable way to stay connected to the reality that the body and the work are the same project. I am 45 years old. I feel clearer than I have felt at any prior point in my life. And if there's anything this experience taught me, it's this. 1. What you build in silence is protected in ways that what you build loudly never can be, because the people who would have talked you out of it never had the chance. 2. Documentation is not distrust. It is the language that institutions understand, and learning to speak it fluently is one of the most powerful things a person can do on their own behalf. 3. You are not the verdict that your family delivered about you. You are what you chose to do in the years after they delivered it. Was I wrong to spend 11 months working inside Marcus Holt's organization, in a role I was qualified for, without revealing that I owned the building he worked in? Tell me in the comments. If this story gave you strength, hit that like button. It means more than you know.